Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark. Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.
Hey, good morning. Feels like I just did this last night. I don't know how many people I'm going to get here. It's a beautiful Saturday morning in southeast Minnesota. I don't know about anywhere else, but it's a bit, as we used to euphemistically say in earlier time in my life, with men who are a lot more guttural and brutal verbally than we're used to today. It's a bit nipply. And what they really were saying, it's a bit nippy outside, but guys and their humor. So yeah, welcome aboard. As you can see, I've got the nice long scroll down at the bottom. If you're watching this on the Facebook, or you're watching this on the YouTubes, you can find me at other places. So check that out. I'm drinking my coffee out of my mug this morning. This is episode. What did I end up? Did I count that right? It was episode 6. This is episode 6 of Defining Good Cop. And it's really, this one's a little bit more personal, because I think that sometimes we have to have an idea of a personal relationship to a topic, and that's not I'm not trying to use a logical fallacy there. I'm not trying to say that you can't relate to a situation if you haven't, been through a situation. It's like the individuals that I have on, Ann Quiner, Dana, and Kimberly, and Curtis coming up on Monday, who have lost family members to COOF protocols. Not to the COOF, but to the COOF protocols. I have not been through that, and I wouldn't want to go through that. But I can relate on a certain level. But sometimes when it comes to a certain topic, it takes personal experience for us to be able to, for lack of better terminology, gain a modicum of reliability on the topic. And so that's what I'm gonna do today, because as you know, I've gone through on defining a good cop, and I've explained the constitutional nature of policing, that even though the word police seems to be derivative of policing, of policy, policing doesn't mean just running around enforcing policy. Policing kind of comes from the perspective of security. And we can have some different debates about whether or not I need somebody to keep me secure or not. But that's really kind of what police should be doing. But they should be doing it through a constitutional lens. And then we can also have a conversation about things like qualified immunity or civil asset forfeiture, and what those things are and what they look like, and whether or not we should even allow things like civil asset forfeiture, whether or not we should allow things like no-knock warrants, whether or not there should ever be a judge who's willing to do those things. But we should also be talking about whether or not qualified immunity needs to change. And I've had those conversations. We've had conversations about red flag laws and how they can be abused and will be abused and continue to be abused. Now, as cops are being used in swatting incidences, we saw this in Rochester here just a few weeks ago, where I don't believe it was just a prank, but pretty much every school district in the city of or not school district, but every school, high school in the Rochester public school system was swatted. People were reporting shootings. And there were 12 others throughout the state of Minnesota, minimum. And then there were also happening across the country. Those aren't pranks. and the police are responding to that. And when you take people in a potentially high stress situation, you put them into these moments where people can just call and make these kind of reports, i.e., red flag laws, ramping it up to swatting. People are going to get killed who shouldn't. I've talked about, Uvalde. I've talked about Duncan Lemke. Those videos are all here in the series for you to watch. I would encourage you to go and watch that. But what's it look like on a factual, objective, almost in a granular way? What does it look like for us to really look closely at what your local law enforcement that may have an impact on you do, and how do they respond to things? Because everybody says, hey, those kind of corruption problems, those are things that happen in big cities, or those kind of corruption problems, those are things that happen in small towns without any accountability. And it's not in my small town. It's not my small town. It doesn't happen in my small town, folks. Hi, Christine. Thanks for stopping in. Looks like it's just you and me. Should have just brought you on the show this morning. But and that's everybody's response. Or it doesn't happen in my town. And this really strong back the blue sentiment within conservatism, especially, is shifting. We know that because over the last 2 years, what we learned is that law enforcement, by and large, the rank and file may have opinions that run counter to what the leadership would hold, but the leadership in law enforcement, the hand that guides the organization, goes along with everything they're told to do. Perful. I'm not even drinking. It's 9:23, and it sounds like I've been drinking. I sound more like I've been drinking than when I'm not than when I am drinking. It's because I don't do these early morning ones very much anymore. This isn't even early morning. What am I talking about? Some of you have been up for 6 hours. A personal example that I'm referring to is the reality that Olmsted County was attacked by the critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical sexual theory crowd by saying that they are insensitive, and the sheriff put out, no, our staff get training in, all of these, social justice issues, and they're well trained in these. And there wasn't a lie. We did get indoctrinated. Sheriff Torgerson was all aboard getting everybody indoctrinated. He might have been with kind of an eye roll, but he did it because publicly he wanted to save face, and that was the wave of the future. So in my last year at the sheriff's office, even though I knew the writing was on the wall, I knew that they were going to come for me eventually. We got put through a massive training regimen that made us do some deep dives into like the 1619 Project. They had a former cop come on and talk about white privilege and white fragility. And he quoted from 1619, talked about how white cops need to understand that they are implicitly biased. I mean, we had implicit bias training, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And then we had to write an essay after watching two other cops, former cops, talk about how wicked white cops were. And one of those, the essay had to be written based on what we agreed with this one particular speaker and where we agreed with them and why we agreed with them. And I picked the most controversial of this person's speeches, which of course would be considered tame, even 3 years later, and said, here's why I completely disagree, not just with this speaker, with her standard. And I have that essay. I'm going to be posting it here on Facebook pretty soon. But not only here's why I don't agree, but here's why I reject wholesale this entire idea of implicit bias that only exists for X. And I had to submit that, and I did. And fellow staff were like, man, this is taking you a long time to write this essay. And I'm like, yep. Like, well, can we read it? And I said, sure. So I sent it to a bunch of people. And I had a couple of people like, I think I'm going to just copy and paste that. I'm like, don't you dare. If anybody gets in trouble for this, it should be me. But so your local law enforcement agency, the leadership, is going to go along with the current trends. And I don't mean the current trends in your hometown. I don't mean the current trends. If you're in a small all black town in the South somewhere, and you have the push for the radical acceptance of the LGBTQ community, and they want to have a parade in your town, and you have a bunch of conservative church-going black officers, you're going to get ordered to go take part in that parade. Don't think that your leadership is going to be safe from that kind of compromise because they happen to be a particular ethnicity or a particular socio-cultural perspective. And don't think for a minute that all the other agencies might be open to corruption, but your agency in your town is going to be the stalwart one, that somehow they're not going to cave into and fall down for all of the garbage that's happening. And don't think for a minute that they're not capable of corruption. Even when they have this glowing personality that just seems to be super friendly and shows up at all of these special events that aren't really related to law enforcement or are somehow law enforcement adjacent by, I think you mean the COOF, Christine, COOF, not COUV. That's some other thing that you made up. But it's, yeah, see, it's not that. It's COOF. Anyway, your local cops, white, black, Hispanic, Native, First Nations, you name it, they're going to toe the line. And the ones that don't are going to be made an example of, unless there's a way for the leadership to get away from being embarrassed or not be embarrassed by going public about something that somebody has done wrong. Now, the thing that's really a thorn in the side of law enforcement leadership today, and therefore really law enforcement in the community as a whole, and there again, I have a brother that's been a cop for over 20 years. He is a phenomenal cop. Phenomenal. Absolutely one of the best. He's a good guy. I'd die for him. He's the guy you want at your domestic. I've said that before. And he's talking about, like, okay, I can't wait to get to where I can retire. And he's marginally younger than I am. And by marginally, I mean 7 years, 6.5. But sorry about that. I have a couple of other friends that I've known for a very long time that are good cops. Good cops. For a fact. One I know that has looked at his sergeants and his lieutenants and said, I'm not doing that. Do what you're going to do to me, but I am not doing that. And you know who you are, because you don't always agree with some of my content. But I've lost others who I thought were good friends, who I thought were good cops, that like distance themselves from me because of my commentary on Uvalde. One of them, Christian brother, came out and attacked me, saying that I become radicalized because I was calling for criminal charges against all of the Uvalde officers, and anybody who defended it needs to really question whether or not they should be in law enforcement anymore. And he blocked me after calling me a coward and a coward and radicalized and whatnot, when I didn't attack him. So we're gonna do something here, And I'm not going to name names in particular, but I'm just going to give you a handful of examples about nepotism and how nepotism and the good old boy club and the blue wall of silence uh, is dangerous, and that it does take place in good old Minnesota, and that it does take place down here in Rocks and Cows, Minnesota, in the third largest metro area of the state, which is 120,000 people. But we're still pretty rural. We still have that country feel. The local guys are country. They're 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 out hunting and fishing and on their days off. They're these kind of people, right? That's that's they're salt of the earth types. It does happen. When Sheriff Torgerson took office at several years ago, the current director of detention services, who she had some leftist tendencies, but I got along with her really well because she was she was balanced. She was a balanced individual. I trained her daughter. Her daughter applied to be a detention deputy, and she shadowed me for part of a shift. And the next day, the director of detention services approached me and said, "Hey, so and so wants you to be her FTO." And I said, I looked right at her and I said, "Ma'am, you need to understand that I'm going to treat her exactly the same way I treat every other new hire. She's not going to get a break just because she's your daughter." And she looked at me and she said, "That's exactly why you," and I'm not making this up. I have no reason to stroke my ego or puff myself up for this. She goes, "That's exactly why you are the best option for her, because I know that you're not going to cut her a break just because of who she's related to." And sorry, I'm checking some stuff here. And I did. I ended up training her. And she when I was done, I'm like, she's going to be okay. She's going to be a good deputy. But that director of detention services, when Torgerson took office, the only reason that any of this happened is that they had personality differences. Torgerson didn't like her. I'm pretty sure she didn't like Torgerson. And ultimately, Torgerson, instead of waiting for her to retire in a couple of years, which is what she was going to do anyway, Torgerson demoted her from director of detention services, basically chief deputy of detention services. Not basically, that's what she was. She was a chief deputy directly under him. There was nobody else above her. The chief deputy of detention demoted her to a captain's position within the sheriff's office and put her in an office working on policy rewrites after she had spent years in a senior position. Who did he put in her place? Brian Howard. What experience did Brian Howard bring to detention? He'd been a road cop for 20 years. His only experience in a detention center wasn't even in a full-fledged detention center. It was just in a local jail here in Fillmore County, where he was a jailer for a very brief time in a very small facility that ultimately had none of the kind of issues and concerns that a county like Olmsted has with its rising crime rate and its rising population. That's it. That's all the experience that he had. He had to come in and do what a good leader should ultimately do, which is rely on subordinate leadership and staff to be doing their jobs. But he had no idea what he was doing. It was a nepotistic promotion. Torgerson and Howard were buddies. They got along well. He wasn't the best fit for that job. And it was clear from day one. Just clear. Right? So that's one, right? Well, that daughter, she was too closely related to that director of detention services, and they came for her, and they put her out on administrative leave under some trumped up charges that a lot of people were, they never tell you what's going on, but the rumor mill gets a hold of bits and pieces of information, and that gets spread, and this misinformation kind of gets put out there, and they don't ever tell you, and the only way you can find out is to talk to the person, and they make it very clear that you shouldn't really be talking to these people. It was kind of what they did to me. They put her out for unpaid administrative leave for a year while they worked on investigating her. Do you know how many years she got in prison for the crimes that she allegedly committed? I'll wait. How many years? Anybody watching want to just type in an answer here? How many years do you think she got? 0. You want to know why? Because there was no crime. There was no evidence of a crime. And if they did find something they thought was evidentiary, there wasn't enough to prosecute her. So they just persecuted her instead. She was one of the first people to reach out to me when she found out what was going on in my life. A year that they did that to her. How many thousands of dollars do you think was spent just to pay her a year's salary, a year's freaking salary, ladies and gentlemen? A year for that. Not to mention the money spent on the benefits were continued to pay out to her. She continued to accrue PTO, and the money on the investigation that the sheriff's office had to invest. Not to mention the fact that if there were other agencies involved, those agencies had to pay for that. A year for nothing. A year for nothing. And ultimately, I'll tell you, it came down to the fact that she was just somebody's daughter, and they didn't want any reminder of that person around. Here's another example, and this kind of predates Torgerson, but it kind of goes to the mentality of the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office. As some of you know, there was a riot in Rochester in the detention center years ago, and the person who was supposed to be there that morning, the sergeant of that platoon that was supposed to be there that morning, decided to take that morning off and go to breakfast, leaving her assistant duty sergeant in place. Some decisions needed to be made, and maybe they weren't made in a perfect way. Maybe they weren't said perfectly, but 2 of the best deputies that I've ever known were working that day, and this riot kicked off. Millions of dollars of damage were done. And the assistant duty sergeant, the ADS, it wasn't an official promotion. It was just a person who had enough seniority that they could be trusted to make the right decisions. She got left holding the bag. And for the rest of her career with the sheriff's office, they mocked her. Oh, you're the one who started your personality caused you did this, you did that, right? Well, that person's boss, direct boss, the sergeant that just decided to go take the morning off and go have breakfast, and that's how it's been relayed to me. So I'm just speculating here, but these are public servants, so I get to do that, and they can't say anything else. That public servant who was not where she needed to be, she got promoted later. She became a training sergeant. And then training and compliance division. And then she got promoted to sergeant, or to captain, where she still sits today. Why? That kind of egregious failure, heads should have rolled. Millions of dollars. Millions of dollars. The detainees were wrong. It's like talking about Ukraine and Russia. There's no good guys here. The detainees were wrong. They shouldn't have rioted, especially in Olmsted County, because you had to share a bunk with somebody. Or not a bunk, but a cell with somebody, when you're used to having a cell to yourself. Right? Well, that's what happens when crime goes up and we lock up mostly drug offenders. Well, the person who was working that day, she's gone now, and she's much better off. She's so much happier. So much happier. But that other, the one who is directly responsible by being irresponsible is going to ride out the rest of her time on a captain's salary. Six-digit salary. And never get held accountable. Because ultimately, when you can bounce back and go into that kind of position, that's not being held accountable. And it's not like Torgerson didn't know. I mean, he removed the director of detention services over personality issues. He could have very easily have removed this gal. Right? They've done it to numerous. I have a former coworker who was in a supervisory position, who is still a friend, who was placed out on administrative leave because one deputy filed a complaint that he created a hostile working environment. Months this guy was out on administrative leave. We had no idea what he was accused of doing. None. No idea. The persecution that was the persecutory war that was waged on him was incredibly damaging. And guess what? He won. Not only did he win, he came back. There were no reprimands. Arbitration wouldn't allow reprimands. They're like, you guys, this is ridiculous. What you're doing is ridiculous. You can't do this. He's doing his damn job. And they still tried to write him up after he came back to work, and he told them, no, I'm not going to accept it. But why didn't they like him? He was outspoken. He challenged leadership when they were wrong, which is exactly what you want from rank and file supervisors, sergeants, and even deputies. You want them to challenge leadership when they think they're wrong. Prove to me why you're not wrong, and I'll do what you want me to do. But he was an easy target because people's feelings get hurt. I'm sorry. That's another massive problem with law enforcement today. So many people out there, you go watch these auditors, and I'm not talking about the freakazoid auditors who go out there and call cops effing pigs and fry the bacon and all that stuff, but like literal First Amendment and Second Amendment auditors who are polite, decent, civil, engaging, high charisma levels, go out and do First Amendment audits, and a cop walks up and goes, I need to see some ID. I don't need to give you ID. Yes, you do. I'm like, no, I don't. I don't need to give you ID. I don't need to give you ID. You do too. I demand your ID. You don't have the authority to demand my ID. What gives you that authority? Immediately butthurt, right? There's a channel. It's called Here's the Deal. You need to watch him because he uses this phrase a lot. It's like crack to these guys. And respect is massive. You will respect my authority. And anytime you question them or anytime you say no to them, they're immediately butthurt. Butthurt. Just absolutely butthurt. They can't handle it. They cannot handle pushback. Where does that come from? It comes from an environment of not being able to handle pushback. Period. So I'm gonna give one more example of unequal treatment here that went well for the deputy. During the COOF restriction and the COOF shutdowns, Olmsted County Sheriff's Office, like everybody else, started sending everybody home on their days off to do, because we had mandatory monthly training and we had to attend. Well, some of these were done via Zoom. In one particular situation, that's a long 8-hour day on Zoom, one of the deputies was sitting there, apparently started drinking about 3/4 of the way through the day, made some smart-ass comments that were picked up on Zoom, and he got summoned to the Chief Deputy Brian Howard's office the next day. He showed up to the Chief Deputy's office drunk, clearly under the influence. Now, this isn't rumor, this is true. And I'm not naming names, but it's true. This did happen. Ultimately, he had driven there under the influence. enough so that the chief deputy could pick up on it, and this deputy was administered a preliminary breath test. So I don't know how long he was there. I don't know what the exact levels were. I can't speculate. I'm not going to speculate. I'm not going to say that he was technically legally drunk because I don't know that. But what I do know is that deputy was driven home by the chief deputy. Let that sink in. And eventually came back to work. I think he was out on administrative leave for like a week or something. So basically, it could have been a week of 5 shifts, could have been a week of 2 shifts, whatever. Which was his right, to get paid for that until they made a determination. But probably has an alcohol problem. Probably. Now you juxtapose that with another individual who got a DUI and was put out on paid administrative leave for months, while the sheriff tried to, and he did get the DUI. There's no arguments there. So it's not perfectly analogous, but he did get put on paid administrative leave, and Sheriff Torgerson tried to demote him, tried to fire him. That didn't work. Tried to demote him, and argued back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between the sheriff's office and the attorneys about what they could do and what they couldn't do, and eventually this person came back. But you don't think that's scarring when you get treated that way by leadership? You don't think that makes your staff get jaded? So here's this example of one deputy drinking, making smartass comments during training. So technically on duty. You're technically on duty during training. Getting summoned in to talk about what your conduct on duty was. Under the influence. Out for a week, comes back, no problem. I don't know. And none of my business of how they handled it as far as what the requirements they put on him or didn't put on him when he came back. Other guy, off duty, does something. Here's the deal. When it comes down to with senior law enforcement leadership, it's very rarely is it ever about what you actually did or did not do wrong or whether or not you need help or don't need help. It's about how you make me look. Right? It's about how you make me look and whether or not I can cover it up. So in the case of the guy who got drunk during training and then showed up under the influence of alcohol, that could be covered up because nobody had to know. We could handle that internally and nobody needed to know. So nobody needed to see this. So there was never going to be any embarrassment for the sheriff's office and never going to be any embarrassment for Torgerson. But you get caught doing something wrong. And the only reason we're going to hold your feet to the fire is not because you're this atrocious criminal, but because you might make the office look bad. Which is precisely why they came after me. And trumped up. Like, okay, not big T Trump, but little T Trump. Like, before Donald Trump was president, when we still understood what it meant to be trumped. Which is what led to, and this is some of my personnel jacket, right? But this front 40-some pages, are all of the false accusations that they trumped up that were written out in a way that was designed to make me look like a massive criminal, right? So we have one guy who actually does something that can be covered up, so they cover it up. You have another guy who does something that can't be covered up. They're related because it involves alcohol. And so we're going to go after him and make an example out of him because not because he did something wrong, but he did, but because it embarrasses us. But this is the one that should piss you off. And so if you want to, you can clip this out. I know for a fact that someone reported this to local media. I know for a fact it was reported. And that local media basically responded with, well, it's an election year. You're only trying to get Torgerson in trouble. So, guys, I want you to understand Kevin Torgerson is running unchallenged for sheriff. And this is why this is so important to defining a good cop. And so, yeah, I'm releasing this knowing it can't hurt him in the campaign. But I'm hoping that the pro police accountability people, I'm hoping that the pro hold law enforcement accountable, hold leadership accountable people in Olmsted County and Rochester in the state of Minnesota will start to reach out. I'm begging you guys that you will I'm begging you guys to reach out and start to demand the truth behind everything that happened in what I'm about to tell you. Sunday, I believe it was it was a Sunday afternoon, November 11/9/2019, so almost 3 years ago. And I want you guys to understand that I sat on this and sat on this and sat on this and sat on this because it has been eating at me. Eating at me. This is not easy because the individual involved I like. But it doesn't make it okay. And because I didn't witness it, I wasn't there for this. It was my Sunday off. It was my weekend off. I had very little I could do about it. So this incident I'm about to tell you about took place at 13:50 hours on November 9th of 2019. I'm going to share something with you here real quick. Olmsted County has what is referred to as a use of force continuum or a response to resistance. And in that response to resistance, there is a phrase called conducted energy device. A conducted energy device is a taser. You would know them as tasers. The intent of the conducted energy device is very clear. And people have gone back and forth, vacillated on what they should be used for, how they should be used. But Olmsted County has determined that they should be used for only one thing. And I'm going to show you here. This is from Olmsted County Sheriff's Office policy manual. This is policy 304. This is 304.1, conducted energy device. This policy provides guidelines for the issuance and use of taser. You can see here 304.2 policy. The taser device is intended to control a violent or potentially violent individual while minimizing the risk of injury. The appropriate use of such a device should result in fewer serious injuries to deputies and suspects. Now, 304.4 says verbal and visual warnings. A verbal warning of the intended use of the taser device should precede its application unless it would otherwise endanger the safety of deputies or when it is not practicable due to the circumstances. Now, I'm going to tell you that this was not written by anybody in the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office. This is kind of like pretty standard language. So the purpose of the warning is to provide the individual with reasonable opportunity to voluntarily comply, provide other deputies and individuals with the warning that the taser device may be deployed. If after a verbal warning an individual is unwilling to voluntarily comply with the deputy's lawful orders and it appears both reasonable and feasible under the circumstances, the deputy may, but is not required to display the electrical arc provided that a cartridge has not been loaded into the device, or the laser in a further attempt to gain compliance prior to the application of the taser device. The aiming laser should never be intentionally directed into the eyes of another, as it may permanently impair his or her vision. The fact that a verbal or other warning was given or the reasons it was not given shall be documented by the deputy deploying the taser device in the related report. So here's 304.5. The taser device has limitations and restrictions requiring consideration before its use. The taser device should only be used. This is key. The taser device should only be used when the operator can safely approach the subject within the operational range of the device. Although the taser device is generally effective in controlling most individuals, deputies should be aware that the device may not achieve the intended results and be prepared with other options. 304.5.1. The taser may be used in any of the following circumstances when the circumstances perceived by the deputy at the time indicate that such application is reasonably necessary to control a person. To control a person. I want you guys to stick with me here, okay? I know this is longer than what you thought, but you need to stick with me. A, the subject is violent or is physically resisting. The subject has demonstrated by words or actions an intention to be violent or to physically resist and reasonably appears to present the potential to harm deputies, him or herself, or others. Mere flight from a pursuing deputy without other known circumstances or factors is not good cause for the use of the taser device to apprehend the individual. So in the parlance of law enforcement, basically there's two types of resistance. There's passive resistance and there's active resistance, which involves physically resisting or using violence to resist. In this situation, and I read the reports, I don't have them here, I'm not going to go into it. In this situation, this platoon that was working was conducting their monthly shakedown of the intake unit. This detainee was in a cell by himself. He was a frail old man. He was drug-addled. He refused to get off his bunk. He wasn't offering any violence. He was just saying, I'm not getting up. This is known as passive resistance. The taser is not allowed in this situation. They tried to reason with him. They talked to him. They said, hey, you got to get up. You don't have a choice. You're here. This is what you have to do. You need to comply, on and on and on. They finally hollered out, hey, so-and-so, the shift supervisor that day, the platoon sergeant was off that day and his corporal was working. And they said, what do you want us to do here? I don't care what you do. Just get him out of that cell. Deputy in question pulls out his taser. No warning. Says, I'm going to tase you. Pop. The guy's laying on his bunk. Pop. Tases him. They go in, cuff him, remove him from the cell. This is a clear use of excessive force. This is a violation of Sheriff's Office policy, and it goes directly against the use of force continuum in the response to resistance training, as it had been trained to staff for years. It had been trained to staff for years. There were other ways of going in there and dealing with him. They could have used pepper spray. They could have gone in and said, hey, we're going to escort you out. And then if he escalated to the level of force, then you take a step back and then you tase him. But that's not what happened. The reports are clear. That is not what happened. This individual, this deputy, followed a perceived command, made the decision to use a taser in a situation where the taser was not allowed. He was put out on administrative leave. I don't know what happened to a superior officer in this situation. I don't know what decisions were made. Okay? I don't know. I do not know. But I do know that what this deputy did was wrong. And it was even abusive. I'm sure he was presented with some options. But he was presented with the options that everybody hates. But the option that he and the sheriff's office determined was the best settlement for them was to retire, and they threw him a freaking party. They threw him a freaking party for his retirement. You know what that party is? That party, when a person retires, is, hey, thanks for being here for all these years, for committing yourself to this line of work, on and on and on. Here, we are going to honor you and recognize you for your stellar number of years of working here. And he was a good guy. I liked him. I got along with him. He had personality conflicts with other people. Not going to argue that. It had led to a lot of tension over the last year or so. But he abused his authority. He used excessive force. He violated policy and procedure. He violated the civil rights of an individual who he was responsible for protecting, not just securing, but for protecting. He was put on an administrative leave and then was allowed to retire. And all of this was swept under the rug. And when this was reported to the local media outlets, no one responded, other than one who said, well, we're not going to cover it. And there again, I know this for a fact. We're not going to cover it because you don't have any corroborating evidence, is what the individual was told. So shame on the media in Rochester, in southeast Minnesota. But shame on Kevin Torgerson. Kevin Torgerson tried to make examples of numerous people over non-public stuff that had absolutely, in the one case, they just didn't like the outspoken supervisor. In another case, they gave a guy a little, barely a slap on the hand and let him come back to work after he, was drunk on duty, showed up drunk for the meeting about being drunk or under the influence. He was under the influence on duty, which is a big no-no. Even in training, policy about training is you cannot drink while you're in training. You will remain professional. All of the standards of on duty apply when you're on training duty. Slap on the hand, basically, after showing up to the meeting about being under the influence while on duty, shows up for the meeting under the influence, gets a ride home, gets a couple of days off, and gets to come back to work. But they demoted a former director of detention services because they didn't like her. Couldn't let her retire out of that position. Couldn't wait the 2 years. Think of how different that would have looked if he would have come under her wings. Brian Howard had come under her wings to really see what a real director of detention services was like. And there again, I had some social, cultural, political differences with her, but I liked her. Imagine how that could have impacted him, the positive influence she could have had on him, and what he could have learned from her if he would have invested the time. The sheriff would have invested the time to say, hey, come under her, find out what that job is really like. And then when she retires, the position is yours if you want it. Nope. We're going to demote her. We're going to teach her a lesson because we can't fire her. We can't get rid of her, but we're going to make her uncomfortable. We're going to stick her in the Olmsted County gulag. We're going to stick her out there in the sheriff's office archipelago, reference to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because we don't like her. This other guy, he didn't do anything that the public was aware of, so they didn't need to get rid of him. In this case of this individual tasing this passively non-compliant, cantankerous, grouchy, foul-mouthed old man who, if I saw him out on the street, I'd walk across the street to not even have to see him. He's my age, and I call him old man because he looked like he was 90. But because he was a criminal, and it was a deputy, and it wasn't public, he got to retire. Look at all of the people that Kevin Torgerson has run off or investigated throughout his tenure, throughout his time as a public servant, as sheriff. Look at that. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and hours in investigation and in paying people, and then ultimately paying out settlements to so many people. Settlements. Thousands of dollars worth of settlements. Not because the people took settlements because they knew they were going to lose their jobs and not get anything, but because the sheriff's office in Olmsted County knew that they were in the wrong, and the only way to make it go away and go away quietly was to pay settlements. And that's what they do. But nope, this guy actually breaks policy and procedure. This guy actually abuses his power. He abuses his authority. He uses excessive force, and he and the person directly over him don't even get slaps on the wrist. There's no repercussions, because the public doesn't know. And Kevin Torgerson is exactly the problem with law enforcement leadership today. And it bleeds down through his other leadership and down into the ranks. As long as you don't get caught publicly and you don't embarrass this office, and by this office, it's don't embarrass Kevin Torgerson, you can do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. Am I saying that Kevin Torgerson is corrupt as in he's getting paid off by criminal elements? No, I don't believe that. For one, Kevin Torgerson's not smart enough to work something like that out. And he doesn't have anybody in a senior leadership position that's smart enough to pull something like that off. They're not smart enough to go link up with some criminal element to do that. But see, you don't have to be a crafty criminal to be corrupt. You don't have to be Joe Blow, mafia boss with a connection to law enforcement to, like that. See, corruption's not just about somebody getting paid off. Being corrupt is not just about, going out on the streets and beating people down and then never getting held accountable. Because that doesn't happen that much anymore. I'm like, now there are literally cops who are getting persecuted, not prosecuted, being prosecuted. There are now cops who are literally being persecuted and prosecuted when they are doing the right thing. Go back here to a couple years ago when the man shot and killed the girl with a knife who was about to stab another girl. But boy, he got run through the ringer. They wanted to charge him with murder. They wanted him fired. They wanted him to never feel safe again because he shot a girl with a knife. So there are cops out there who are doing their jobs, and they're doing them right, and they're still being attacked for it. But by and large, with the prevalence of body cams and recording devices all over society today, it's really hard for cops to get away with public corruption, with public abuses of their authority. And we need more of that. We need more people auditing. You have an interaction with a cop on the street. You have an interaction with any person who is a public servant. You go into a public building, record. You go into a city hall, record. You go into the post office, record. You go into the county courthouse to court administration, you need to record. And you need to make sure that it's all recorded. Interaction with cops, record. Record, record, record. That's how we're going to get transparency back. The problem is when you have things that can be swept under the rug, like what happened here with this individual getting tased and then the deputy being allowed to retire. I'm telling you, people, you need to dig into this. People need to start asking questions. We can't take Torgerson down. We can't get him unelected. We can't get him challenged in the last month. But I want all of the police accountability people in Rochester. I want the Rochester City Council. I want the Olmsted County Board, County Commission. Start asking these questions. Do you know about this? Do you know what he did? Are you aware? And then think about how I was treated by the same organization versus what this individual did. This is corruption, folks. It might be corruption due to ignorance. It might be lack of intellectual ability, but corruption is corruption. Like, I'm not going to lie. I'll tell you right now. When it comes to philosophical debate and philosophical reasoning and ideological pursuits, every single guest I have on my show proves how unintellectual I am. That being said, I look like Voltaire compared to Kevin Torgerson and Brian Howard on their best days. That's who's leading your law enforcement these days, my friends. The vast majority of people are either hard in leadership or either hardcore leftists because they've been pushed into that direction to be safe, to keep their jobs, to bow to the current cultural narrative, or they're just intellectually weak and malleable, and they're very much ego-driven. And that's Kevin Torgerson. Intellectually weak, intellectually malleable, will bend to the winds of whatever society is saying at the time. He'll give you the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that we're not going to do things, but then he does them because he wants to stay popular. He wants to keep getting elected. And it has nothing to do with him actually doing a damn thing for Olmsted County. It makes him look good. He gets to shine. But when you try to pin him down, he can't shine as much. And quite frankly, the fact that his chief deputy of detention services does what he tells him to do and they go after people the way they do and lose almost every time. My settlement was their loss, not mine. I mean, I lost the career because I knew they were going to keep coming after me. We'd still be fighting. And I just needed to get on with my life because I was never going to go back for them. Even when I won, I was never going to go back to work for them. But they lose every time. They lose constantly. Very rarely have they won. Kevin Torgerson has paid out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars through all of this stuff. And then one situation where they could have said, no, we're not going to tolerate it, they let the guy resign. What the actual French toast? Why? Because it wasn't ever going to reflect on Kevin Torgerson, because they could keep the record sealed and no one in Olmsted County, no one in Rochester was ever going to know that they had a deputy who abused the civil rights, who used cruel and unusual punishment on a detainee. Cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know. I think there is somewhere. I'm like, let me look it up. Do I know those words? What are those? Does that? Let's see, folks. Cruel and unusual punishment. Let's see here. Cruel and unusual. Oh, it's in an amendment. What is that? Oh, wait. That's in the U.S. Constitution? The hell you say? Huh. That's just... Huh. That's weird. It's right there in the amendment. That's very weird. That was cruel and unusual punishment. Happened right under the face. Patrick says, what can county admin do? They can start forcing the sheriff to stop investigating people all the time. Tell them we're going to cut your purse strings. See, the sheriff is unsupervised. Nobody oversees the sheriff. And that's really kind of how it should be. The problem is the budget of a sheriff's office is still tied to, which is why it's not a sheriff's department. There is no such thing as a sheriff's department. Every sheriff in the United States is elected. They're not appointed by a county commission. They're not appointed by a county director. They're not appointed by a mayor or a city council. They are elected. Every sheriff is to be elected. Therefore, it's not a sheriff's department. It's a sheriff's office. But their office is still funded by the county, and therefore the purse strings of the county control what the sheriff can and cannot do, who they can hire, who they can't hire, what kind of equipment they can buy, and they have to get approval for everything when it comes to spending like that. So a county admin can really put the screws to a sheriff's office and say, you're going to start doing a better job. But instead, counties go along, they circle the wagons. And they pay out and they pay out and they pay out to keep it from ever going public just how bad they are. And that's exactly what the county HR guy said to my attorney. What do we need to do to make this go away quietly? Because they knew they were going to lose. And that's exactly what ended up happening with this individual who violated this man's civil rights. It went away quietly, so they gave him a retirement party. And now no one will ever know. Well, maybe they will now. Maybe somebody watching this out there right now will pay enough attention to demand that the sheriff's office start answering questions on this. So if you're watching in the Olmsted County area, if you're watching in the Rochester area, if you're in Minnesota, if you're in anywhere, I would suggest that you start calling and demanding to know what happened on the day of November 11th or on November 9th, 2019 at 1350 hours when the Alpha platoon, the A platoon was working during a shakedown. Start to ask questions. What deputy did it? What supervisor did it? I mean, it's 3 years down the road, but maybe we could get the sheriff's office to be held accountable still. And I apologize for sitting on this for so long. This is hard because I know that nobody's going to pay attention. My regulars will watch. My regular fans, my regular followers will pay attention, but there's a phrase that runs around, especially in the libertarian community. It's back the blue until it happens to you. Well, it's happened to me and it's happened to others. Kevin Torgerson is corrupt. He's just not a corrupt genius. He's a corrupt nincompoop. And I want you to start paying attention to your local sheriff's office. I want you to start paying attention to your local police department. Find the good cops. Tell them they're good cops. But make sure your definition of good cop is actually good cop. Like a guy who stands on the Constitution, a guy who stands up and says you're not going to abuse people with your power. You're not going to strip people of their constitutionally enshrined rights. That's a good cop. A person who gets along with you is not necessarily a good cop. And Kevin Torgerson is not a good cop. Brian Howard is not a good cop. They cover up problems. They cover them up because it makes them look good to keep that stuff covered up. But when you got a guy like me who's vocal and never attaches what he does to his job, that embarrasses them and they have to make an example out of me. That is corruption. The next episode, we're going to be doing a breakdown on what legislation would look like if we could start to get city councils, mayors, county commissions, local state houses, and local state senates, and even at the federal level to start tying all law enforcement funding to constitutional training every year. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive into that. I don't know exactly when that one's going to be, but we're going to be doing that. So, ladies and gentlemen, find parts of this that you like, clip it out, share it with the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office, and start making phone calls to Olmsted County, the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office. The date, one more time, 11/9/2019 at 13:50 hours. That's the time frame we need to be asking about. My friends, until next time, record all of your interactions with all law enforcement and all public servants. Fight for your liberties. They belong to you. Fight for your freedom. It is yours. And sic semper tyrannis.
We are go for liftoff in T-30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at